Hello and welcome to my book review for Sleuth, Nancy Drew and the Women Who Created Her by Melanie Rehak. This is a nonfiction book about the creation of Nancy Drew and essentially everything that has gone into that over like a 70-year period, essentially. I gave this 5 stars. I absolutely love this, like start to finish. It was so interesting. It was so fascinating. I am obviously a Nancy Drew fan, but to be perfectly honest, Nancy Drew was never like my number one. As a kid, I was always Hardy Boys first, Nancy Drew second, largely because I did find the Nancy Drew books to be more frightening than the Hardy Boys, which I read another one recently and that's a little bit silly, but that's fine. This book was just interesting, like start to finish. It was so interesting. There was so much information in it that I didn't previously know and had never thought about. It tells the story of Nancy Drew. The person who created her was Edward Stratemeyer, who created the Stratemeyer Syndicate, which essentially came up with ideas for and contracted ghostwriters to write a number of children's series books, including Nancy Drew, the Hardy Boys, the Bobbsey Twins, many that have been lost to time, like literally dozens, hundreds. He did a lot of series. And then it focuses a lot on his daughter, who eventually became the CEO of the syndicate after his death in the 30s, and she was, even later than that, one of the ghostwriters for Nancy Drew. And then it focuses a lot on Mildred Wirt Benson, who was the earliest ghostwriter for Nancy Drew and wrote a number of the earlier books. In terms of expectations, I really think this book is mismarketed because I wanted to read the description on the back, the final sentence of it, because it is like a little bit, I think it gives people the wrong expectation going in. And this book only has like a 3.5 rating on Goodreads. And I do think it's because the description attracts the wrong type of readers for a book like this. The final sentence is, Melanie Rehak has put together all the clues and tracked down all the suspects. Grab your flashlights and join the gang as we find out the truth about Nancy Drew. And it's like, that makes this book sound really fun and lighthearted and like you're in for a good ride. And I don't want to be like, this book wasn't great. I gave it 5 stars. I thought it was amazing. But it's not really like a fun, lighthearted mystery story, like Nancy Drew vibe kind of thing going on. It's a really like dense, interesting look at behind the scenes of the publishing industry and feminism of the early 20th century and how that created the context in which a character like Nancy Drew was able to be created, and then how the feminism and the way feminism changed throughout the 20th century and like the 50s and the 70s and modern day influenced Nancy Drew's longevity and like essentially created this environment in which a character like her has such enduring popularity. And it's really, really interesting, but it's also really dense and slow and a little bit dry almost at times. And like, I'm not complaining about any of those things. I love books like that. But going into this, I really thought this was going to be a super like quick, lighthearted read, and it wasn't. And I think based on the reviews, a number of other people also had that expectation and then didn't wind up enjoying the book that this actually was. So I really wish it was marketed better, because I do think even if you're not really like a huge fan of Nancy Drew, it's so interesting just to learn about like the publishing industry and like how series books came to be and how books were marketed and like the legal issues behind it. It talks a lot about like how they contracted out to ghostwriters and how that process worked, because they essentially, the syndicate, you know, like either Harriet Stratemeyer or her father or the people they employed would write out these really in-depth outlines and then send them out to the ghostwriters, who would create a book like very much within like these specific guidelines, both like the plot themselves and like the rules the syndicate followed. And then they would like completely rewrite the book once they got them and like edit them to make them the same as all their other books so that there would be like that continuity. And it was really, really interesting, but also like I feel like a lot of people were here for like Nancy Drew good times, and it's not that at all. My favorite part of this was the feminism and just like it really discussed like the context in which Nancy Drew was created, and from the very early 1900s when Mildred Wortenbenson and Harriet Stratemeyer were growing up and like the ways that they became both writer and CEO respectively. And that was, you know, very uncommon for the times, and essentially like how Nancy Drew came to be, because for a very long time girls weren't marketed in terms of like the books that were written. They were written for boys because, you know, the prevailing thought was boys won't read girl books, but girls will happily read boy books, which is oddly still a thought today, I feel like. And then it discussed like how it changed throughout time. Like the Nancy Drew of the early 30s was very different than the Nancy Drew of the 50s or the Nancy Drew of the 70s. And they talked a lot about the major rewrite that all the Nancy Drew books went through in the late 50s and early 60s. And that was really interesting. They changed a lot of like the racism in the books, which I really wish had been discussed more, but it was kind of like glossed over, just like, hey, the books were really racist and Harriet Stratemeyer was really racist the whole time, and like kind of disagreed that the racism was a problem. And it did like gloss over that a little bit more. Like, would have loved more information and like how that existed in the context of like the racist world, because there was so much on the feminism. Could have been a little more on the racism, but it was fascinating. Like, it was just one of those books, like, I love behind the scenes of the publishing industry. Like, I loved hearing about how the ghostwriters were hired and like the process for like them contracting out the outlines. And I really loved hearing about how Harriet Stratemeyer was like getting paid through the publisher, because the syndicate wasn't the publisher. They were kind of the middleman between the writers and the publisher. And then at one point Nancy Drew got sold from their original publisher to, I believe it was Simon and Schuster. And they talked about like that legal battle a lot. And then they talked about like the absolute secrecy of the ghostwriters, because like they sold their rights away as like ghostwriters do. But for a lot of the history of the syndicate, Harriet Stratemeyer really like to pretend like the writers were real, like that Carolyn Keene was a real person, and like she obviously wasn't. Like many people wrote the Nancy Drew books, but it was so interesting the way like it was treated. And she would like do interviews talking like Carolyn Keene was a real person, and she would like write letters, like respond to fan mail for Carolyn Keene, like as if she was Carolyn Keene's secretary. Or like it was really like this whole book was really, really interesting. If you're interested in like behind the scenes publishing stuff for like kids books from the early 20th century, like highly recommend. If you really like Nancy Drew and you're down for like a dense look into how she was created and like the whole backstory there, highly recommend. Like, it was just so interesting start to finish and had so much information. It was just like a wonderful book. I really loved reading it. And it was honestly so much better and so much more than I expected it to be. Let me know down below if you've read Girl Sleuth and what you thought of it if you have. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.